Hey, Ghislaine, how are you doing?
Okay, how about you?
Good. How was your NCO?
I think it went fine. Um, I was in a team where there was like it was me and my I was in a team of two. So
Oh, okay.
so it actually even with that we still I think we still did well. Like I did like half of the problems and my teammate did the other half. So learned a lot.
Oh, that's good. Well, that's the whole point, is to make sure that you learn, right?
Yeah. Um, so I haven't been there's like a weeks where there's like two assignments I haven't been able to turn in the open
Mhm.
VAS. But the
Okay.
reason is because that I think I'm able to install open VAS, but it doesn't show up as services. So there's like the command to start open VAS doesn't work with me. It's like it says like it just doesn't find it in systems. So that's I've been trying to actually figure out why I can install it,
Are
but
you using Kali or?
I've used Kali and Ubuntu. It's like I don't know why. Like
I
neither
know, I know Kali on the later version, it does have
one.
it for OpenVAS. So from what Kali had documented, they have the OpenVAS in Kali. Let me see which version. Yeah, okay. Well, there's tutorial on how you can install it. I think that's what, let me see. Yeah, so let me drop this into the chat for you, because it's it's touch and go in some of the tutorial, because it changed in somewhat, but if you're using Kali, I think I saw some of this. So you have to push the update and then you install OpenVAS. Then you have to do the setup for the GDM, which is the manager, and then you have to start it. And then if you're getting an error, like on the lab documentation, I think you have to rebuild it. It's one of those, so you have to install SQLite with it. If you don't have SQLite, it's not gonna go because it uses like a database. So I know that on the later version of Kali, they did, on their documentation, it shows that they have it, but I don't know if it's removed, but you can always install it on any kind of release. So yeah, let me know if you're running into issues with that. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if you have any problem activating it, just screenshot it for me and then send it to me, and then I can give you some points on where you can go to fix the problem. Okay, let me fix one of the things on your exercise today, because to activate on the Debian side, it might not. Let me try something real quick and then we'll get started. So go ahead and download the notes first. I think I'm just going to omit the virtual machine part. So that is going to be optional, because if you're running virtual machine, CNV. Okay. All right. So let's download the notes and then download the exercise. And I'll talk a little bit about the discrepancy with the virtual environment, but you can run virtual environment inside your Linux, or you can run it straight. It's really up to you. Okay. But I followed their instruction on the tutorial for Flask, and I think there's some discrepancy in the actual instructions. So okay, so let's talk about I was trying to troubleshoot it before we start, but okay. We are gonna do the chapter 10. We're gonna come back to chapter 10 and a little bit of 11, since we're gonna talk about web app assessment. It's really important for your field. I think a lot of the courses don't really touch on web app assessment very much. I think we do a good job in teaching students in security on how to, you know, configure, monitor, assess network and systems. But I think a lot of the things that we use today it has, you know, web content and it is an application on the web. So, and when you're looking at different type of attacks in this field, especially for the pen test area, you do see web application being incorporated, for example, like database, for, you know, to be able to make purchases or do inventory of products for e-commerce company and so on. So I wanted to come back and address this, and then in the next week, we're going to touch on the forensic. I think there's like a small chapter in following, and it touches on some Python tools, and I'll try to work that into some of the later chapter or the later units. So we're going to go to about 2 more units. I will get your project up. I think, you know, I work out a couple of options for the project. So because this class is so wide in the technique and the monitoring tools, so I will give you options on how you want to be able to build your tool. But you will have tools, you will be required to build tools for HTTP server or your web server. And then you can add in the elements on how you want to assess. So for example, like if you want to touch more on the web application side, you can look into the tools and the database side. So in the unit 11 notes, I included some part of 11 which address Flask, because for Python, if we don't explore this, you will run into, you know, issues down the line where you don't know what it is and you don't know how to use it. An option where you can use a framework is to use Django with Python, but Flask is a micro framework, so it works really well with some of the script that we will be using in security to assess web application. So Flask defined based on their website, and I put the link here, is a micro framework that is written in Python. It is used in web application development using model view controller. If you took the advanced Python or the network Python courses, you have seen some of the Flask incorporation in those courses. So MVC is a software architecture that allows you to manage data and logic in your application and how you want to present it. And when we look at the applications, we would normally see how database would be incorporated for the data side, and then we would have an interface that use the functions to be able to access the data. And that is really what software is a way for us to use the function to be able to access resources as data. So Jinja 2 is a template that you can incorporate, and it works with HTML because when you deal with web application, everything is web front. It's usually you would see HTML, JavaScript, and some other languages that depending on the type of application you're working with. But on the front end, you would see HTML and JavaScript quite a bit. And then you would also see Python. And Python, because it is cross-platform, it normally incorporates, and there are abundant amount of library that we can add to get the application to work how we want it to be, and also to analyze data and things like that. So Jinja 2 is just a way that we can use Flask as a template to render information that would be, or your content that would be on HTML. And it would look something like this for your basic template. So you would see with HTML tags. So when you see this, you would know that it is HTML5 compared to your regular HTML for the open tag. And then, additional tags like your headers, your title, your body, and so on. So here your data is going to be incorporated here. So when you use this template out of the box, when you run your template on your server, you would only see the data part. Now, we see that Flask can be used for various things. In pen testing, we would look at cross-site scripting with Flask because it is a framework. It can be incorporated to execute different type of code for injection purposes and so on. On the attacker side, you would see that they would use this for arbitrary code to the website, especially if we don't validate and sanitize the data. And so that is important that we really take a look at the vulnerability of the application and be able to manage that to mitigate the risk. So in the first part of the assignment, it asks you what is Flask and how it's used in application development. We can define Flask as a micro framework in Python. It is used to facilitate the development of the application. And using a framework is definitely an easier way to approach application development, as it would have some of the tools and the functionality that you can customize to make your application more intuitive. And with the model view controller, which is a architecture that separates the data from the logic. And so in that, we can use model view controller in a lot of ways. We can make it where the application performance is elevated through parallel processing. We can also look at how data container is being used. And in the case of database, right, incorporating SQLite with Python and the Flask framework. So in the documentation, you would find some Flask information, but before we hit number 2, and so you can find the answer for 1 on the first page of the notes. And the note's a little bit more lengthy than usual because it has a little bit of both chapters. So let's touch back on here. And when you're looking at a template, for example, if we're using a template with Python, as we are using Flask, we would import that in. And in this particular example, we are doing a redirection for web page. So for example, if I'm moving my website to another location, I would need to redirect, or I can add an additional link to my site, right? Or when they click a button, I would have to redirect. So there are many ways that we can use redirection for, and the attacker can do the same thing, right? For a certain operation. So here we are going to define an object called app. And when you're using Flask, you are going to create an object for its class. Now, we should incorporate validation of the URL, because if you don't, you're going to end up facing URL injection, meaning that they can put in, right, different parameters or characters in the URL to be able to access different part of your website or your web application. So that means that we are going to put this into a list, and the list should contain your domain information. And we want to access this to validate it. So we want some kind of confirmation. And now, so when using Flask, you are going to use a decorator. And the decorator, you would start with the @ symbol. And what that decorator is, if you read the documentation, it is a trigger for a function. So it allows you to use some of the built-in functions to be able to access a certain URL, or in this case, we're using route, so it's going to connect, right, for the redirection purposes. And so when you use the decorator, after that, you can define what the function would be. And so here we are going to define our custom function, which is a redirect URL. And in that function, we want to sanitize. So we want to make sure that the URL is exactly how it's intended to be used and nothing added. And that's important because when you do that, you want it to evaluate that object, okay, once it passed an URL as the parameter. Then, because we want some confirmation, so we're going to go ahead and print it. So we are going to return. And as you return, you want to make sure that you're returning the sanitized location of the URL and also the HTTP response code. Then we have another function called get sanitized, because that's what we also use in the prior function. So here we would implement the requirement or the condition on how it would validate that location. So having the added code that you would see elevate the security of the actual application, because if you don't, you can simply, you would face some risk in that they would try to do URL injection. And web is public front, so that means that anybody can use the browser to touch it or to reach it. So we want to implement any kind of measures that we can to make sure that the risk is reduced. So here we put in if statement, if else statement, and we want to validate the URL. So that is the second step in the validation process. So first you validate the location, then here you are going to put in the criteria on how you would validate the location. Then we're going to call it in main. So we would say if namespace is main, we're going to do an app run. And so the run method is going to allow us to make sure that we are debugging. And you want the criteria for the debug, the parameter here is true. Now you can disable the debugging component to make it false. Okay. So what you would have is you would be able to run your app with the Flask micro framework, right, in Python. Now, when you look at the code and in the example, let's come back to maybe on the next one. And when you look at the example, if it's using an escape method, and well, all that is exactly as its name, it's escaping and validating the data for the input. And so we can incorporate this with Flask to make sure that we control, right, the potential of somebody can inject on our web page or our website or our web app. Okay. Now, on the second example, it shows you how you can use the debugging mode, right? And so if you implement the debug is true, just like what we've seen before. So in this example, you are using Flask. You're also creating the object that is a Flask object. We implemented a class. Our status code is if it is 400, that will be an error, right? We are going to construct the exception handling object. Now here we are going to have a decorator using route, and it's going to show the exception. So it's going to trigger, and we define a main function, right? And so we're going to handle the exception in the case where if it is status code 500. So if it is status code 500, it's going to raise the exception. And then in the main function, we are going to call our app that's going to be run. Now, the reason why it is insecure, even though it is in a debug mode, is because we did not validate anything here. We did not have any kind of security elements that would control on how, right, the user needs to access the URL. So in the following example, it also show you how you can also redirect using Flask in an insecure way. And so when you compare that, right, a lot of times we can't set the location for the URL, but if we don't validate the location for the URL, then it becomes an insecure. Because in your response and header, and as you see this at the beginning of the semester, where we can write the script to look at, right, the response and the request from your server and be able to gather a lot of information from that. And so the attacker can simply do some assessment from your web server, which is open to respond to them, and be able to use it against that particular web application now that they know some information about that web app. So here, what happens is it's only going to return the information in the header saying that that is the location of the URL. And even if we have the debugging mode, right, it is still insecure. So how can we really secure it is to be able to make sure that you validate and sanitize your URL. And so if you look at that, it's simply maybe like 10 or 15 additional lines for a smaller program, but it really controls on how it's going to manage the redirection if it is validated. Okay. And then anything else is going to drop off. So because we don't want to really monitor every single request that comes through, we want to make sure that we control it from the application standpoint. And that's important. Okay. So when you assess the actual code, and in the last lab, you saw how you can do static code analysis, right? That takes a little bit of work and in evaluating the report. But when you're looking at an application, if it doesn't have any kind of sanitization or in validation for input, even in the URL or in the form, then it becomes vulnerable to, you know, attacks and other things. Any question? Okay, so now let's look at how we can attend the Flask. Okay, so when I upload this, if you look at the documentation for Flask, if you're here, right, this takes you to the installation page, and it talks about, you know, how you should set up the virtual environment. You don't have to do it all in Linux. If you have Windows, you can do that. So Flask does work with multiple platforms. And I think some of you have seen this before as you've done this in other classes. And also you need to make a folder, right? And in that folder, you would install, okay? So the missing step here is once you have the folder, you need to install the Python venv, which is the virtual environment. So you have to do sudo, right, apt install Python 3 or Python 3.8 or a certain version, and then your venv. And if you don't have it by this point, this right here, when you issue this command, your command line, your terminal, is going to tell you to install it. Okay, because if you haven't done it before, it's going to need the virtual environment in order to run it. So what that is it's going to use that folder, right, to be able to execute some of the Python script or code based on what you put in it. Okay, so we would have more of a control isolated area to be able to execute our script compared to if we do it in the entire system. Now, optional, right? You can run it. If you've done it before, you can just activate it. But, you know, it's not required. So what I'll do tonight is I'll fix some of the step and I'll highlight it as an option. So if you want to do that, you can. Okay. So they put it in the tutorial and ultimately we can pip install. Okay. So let me come back to my virtual machine here. I recently got TEC Club to put together my computer actually, because I had the parts for a long time. And so they finished it and I put Ubuntu on it. So I hope to use it for your project and different things instead of using my virtual machine. So let me come back here. Let me clear it. Well, before I clear it, I'm going to show you. So if you are doing the virtual environment, let's say I make a my project folder, I go inside the folder or change directory to it, right? When I issue this command, it's going to say, oh, I don't have the virtual environment. So on the Debian Linux, it wants me to install it. And so it tells you to do this. And so you should do a sudo apt install Python 3.8 and then your virtual environment. So once you have it installed like that, then what you're going to do is you are going to move into it. Now, they tell you to use this with bin, right? Of course, like it's not going to be able to locate bin as it is inside this. So what you have to do is you would put in this and then the path, and then you would do an activate. And so you can also go to Python documentation to troubleshoot that particular section. So this part right here, right? Assuming that if you're accessing your virtual environment in bin, then it's going to be able to find that there. But if it's not, you just need to specify the path on where your project folder would be. So I'm going to clear this real quick. So we can do pip 3 install Flask, if I can type it properly. And so it's going to take a little bit to go, but it's going to download and install. So what you want is you want the Flask, right, directory to be able to. So here, this is step B. And what we're going to do is we are going to use Python, and just like what you've seen in the example program, but we're not doing any kind of assessment. So it's kind of show you how you can actually run Flask with Python. Okay. So on the next part, we are going to do a nano hello.py. We're going to make a hello file, which is a Python module. And we are going to use Flask. So let me minimize this and so I can have it next to it. And so we can say from Flask, import Flask with a capital F. So we're going to bring in the class, and then now we're going to build the object. So we're going to construct an object. That is the Flask. And then name. And we are going to have a decorator, app.route, and it's going to use the / there. Then we define a function. So def hello world is, and I forgot the colon. We are going to return P. Now here you would see that there is HTML tag because we are working with Flask and it uses HTML in the template, as you saw that as part of Ginger 2. So therefore our string needs to have HTML tag as part of the string. So we're going to do hello world, and as you use an open tag in HTML, you want to have a closed tag. in HTML. Okay, and then so once we have that, we are going to press Control X, yes, and enter to save. Now, the things that's noted here is that, and even when I took this from their documentation, so that way I can introduce you to a little bit of Flask. So when you use this, right, what you have is you create an instance for the class, and that is going to be used for your web server gateway interface, which is your WSGI for the application. And when you're passing the argument as the name for the application in the module, which is what you see in the next part, what it's going to do is going to use your decorator to be able to trigger the function for the URL. So if I want to utilize a certain trigger, which is the /, right? Then what I can do is I can specify that in with the decorator. And that will allow you to display something on your browser, okay, which is going to be your HTML content. That could be text, or it could be, different element of your page. And it is HTML formatted. Now, the two ways that they mentioned to document or to run your Flask is to use Python command, or if you run it straight from command line, you need to open your Flask app. And here you would want to put in your file name, whatever the Python file would be, like hello.py, then you just use the file name. And then you would execute the Flask run. So when that happens, it's going to activate or run a Flask on your system, which is your local system, your Linux machine. Now, you won't be able to see it unless you open up your browser and you would use the IP address of that system. And in our case, we're using a loopback because we're accessing ourselves, right? Our own system. And it's going to use port 5000. Now, if you're running a firewall, you got to make sure that you can see that port. So in the prior labs, we've seen that, and we can activate or add the firewall port or the port to the firewall, okay, by doing the allow. So on Ubuntu, you would have to check your AWF to make sure that your firewall allows the port, okay? So once that happens, you are going to be able to run Flask through port 5000. And then you can simply check by using your browser, or in command line, you can just call on Firefox. So you can say Firefox, and then you put in the URL. And so now if it opens and if you see hello world, then you are successful. Okay. And if it doesn't, then we would then have to go back and troubleshoot the step. Okay, any question? Okay. So let me try their commands because I know I've done it in Python before. Flask is hello. And then we would do a Flask run. And so it tells you here, right? See how your port, it is running. Now we can go here to our, and forgive me, my virtual machine has about 2 GB of RAM dedicated to it. So, and it's running a lot of different services since I've added 4 different things for the labs over time, right? So it should tell you, okay, so you see here where the debug mode is off. And so this is why when you write it in your Python script, you can enable your debug mode by saying debug is true, right? Then it's going to activate the debugging mode. Okay. Now, if we don't do that, it's going to default as off and it's going to run this. Okay, so it's running. And then, oh, I have two things open. So HTTP 127.0.0.0.1 with 5,000 port. And there we go, right? So we successfully run Flask there. And so that simply shows you that you can incorporate Flask, right? Now, can you do this with a web server and an HTML file for the index? You sure can, right? So it saves us a couple of steps in activating, right, this, where we would just incorporate the framework and then we write a few things and it uses the route here, and then we just define the function on what we want. So this part right here, right, we can put, you know, instead of doing the HTML, you can write it straight in Python like this with the HTML tag if you use Flask. Any question? Okay. So now once I got this far, I know it's running. What I can do is after that, I take a screen capture. Okay. Then what I can do is now let's try to use escape, because the book talks about how escape is used. So and escape is the method that's incorporated with Flask. So we can make it where we can add in different elements on our site. And so for number 3, it tells you that when returning HTML, the default response type in Flask, any user provided values rendered the output must be escaped to protect the injection attack. So using HTML templates that is rendered with Jinja 2, okay, this can be done automatically. But in the text, it talks about even if you use the template, you cannot be for certain that it is 100% secure. So therefore, you need to make sure your script has the validation and the sanitization element. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to write a second file. So I know that this works, so I can close it now. And then I'm going to come back here and it's still going. So whenever that you access it, it's going to show the get and the post. So it shows the status for it, right? And then let me get another one here. Let's see if I can zoom in on this one. Okay. So now I'm on my second terminal window. I'm just going to do a nano hello escape.py. Now you don't want to name your file. If you read the documentation, it tells you do not want it to name your file your package name. So do not call it flask.py or just escape.py is not a good practice either. So we want to name it a unique name. So, and then now we're going to do from markup save import escape. And then we have a decorator app.route. And in this one, instead of just using the slash, we are going to also incorporate name, assuming that we have the user input for their name. And we define a method or a function. So hello name. And we're going to return hello. And our data is going to be escape. And we're going to pass the name variable. Exclamation point, quotation mark to close that up. And then we have another decorator. We're going to use app route again. And on this one, now we are going to just use the slash, and we are going to define index. This is going to be for your index page, which is your landing page mostly. And then that we are going to return index page. Well, realistically, this piece would be, you know, company's information, images. It's a lot more than this, but we're just doing a simple script with Flask. So then we are going to do an app.route. Again, we are going to have the hello extension. Define this hello method as return hello world. Okay. So once you have everything, let me double check. For my hello escape file, I'm going to go ahead and save. So Control X, yes, enter. So here we note that if the user is able to submit some kind of script, let's say the attacker submits some kind of script, the escape method would cause it to render as text instead of running it as a script. So we can protect it from the input by using the escape method. Okay. Now, if we don't implement this, let's say that I just have an index.html file and I would use that at the main directory of where I host my web server, right? It would lack, or it would have the vulnerability. It lacks in security in that, you know, if you ask the user to input their name, like their username, or to register for an account, right? That field, if it's cannot control, then they can inject script there. Okay. And script could be various things. It could be for SQL injection, where they would try to access your database to obtain user account and password hash, or it could just be to, you know, attack your server and or ping, or there are various things. You've been written scripts since day one for this class, so you've seen how that can be done in many ways and using many different tools. So now what we can do next is, again, we already have our Flask running, right? And if you want to test it again, you can do an export Flask app is hello escape. And then you would do a Flask run. Right. So here, what it's saying, let's see. Because it's running on the other one. So saying I have invalid syntax. Let me see. Oh, that's from the module. For the loader. Oh, I see. I didn't put a colon. See, I forgot. Let me go back. My fault. Right here. Just trying to move through things quickly. Okay, this is in Flask. Oh, it's catching something again. Let me see. Oh, yeah, possibly that I have to turn off the other one and then re-enable it. So when you get here, make sure that you stop the other service, right, from the prior, because it's still running that, and then you can activate the second one. Yeah, it's not going to like it that because it's being accessed for the other files, so it's not going to like it. That's going to throw error. Okay. So the whole point in this is, you know, does it really matter that you don't run the hello escape? I like for you to run it so you can see, but you can choose to run this instead of the hello world. That's completely fine with me. The name app is not defined. Stop the other one. Okay, let me see. Right here, are you talking about this one? Or the second one? I think you're talking about the second one, right? Oh, okay. So I see. Yeah, so you need to do the same thing. So let me fix that. I forgot to put this in here. So after you import, you need to do this. Yeah, I got it. So you can revise the first file and then add, you know, add to it. So the whole point is that you can use the decorator and you can define various functions for your website to have different elements. And in this case, right, we want to protect the user input as script. So we want to prevent it coming in as a script. So it teaches you how to use the escape method here. Okay, and in the book, it talks about that. It shows you some example on how you can implement that with the secure, more secure ways, right? So let me fix this. Up, arrow. Let's go up, down, and we are going to define app is a Flask object, and for name. Assuming that everything is good to go. X this, enter. Let's see if I can run it again. Double check to see if I have any issues. Oh, yeah, that's just mostly because also you want to do the same import statement. Otherwise, because you just added that object, this needs to go there as well. I'll re-upload this. Okay, make sure we have that. Oh. Right, because we're using the object, or we're using that class, it needs to come in as well. New function mapping is overriding for existing endpoint function hello. Yeah, it's trying to overwrite that. And then for the wrapper, let's see. Let me come back to the user guide and I'll show you where you can find a lot of the practice. So you want to do HTML escaping. That's where, you know, so there's like a lot of the resources for this. So you have to, because even on the tutorial, right, they just put the snippet. So if you define a variable or an object, you gotta make sure that it's there. Like here, there's a section for login. Okay, so you can use URL for login, and assuming that it's gonna come, it's gonna show like login on the actual page. So it's gonna look for that on the site, and then the username and so on. So you can try different things. And then let me put this link onto the chat for you. Okay. So when we are successful through this, right? I'm fine with you giving me only one screenshot, whether you do the hello world or if you want to try the escape, that's fine. Okay. And then you can voice command activated. Okay. So then are you able to enter your name? It should not allow you to enter your name because with the escape, it's going to control the input for name, right? Okay, so let's move forward. Let's talk about chapter 10 next. Do you have any questions? So that gives you a little bit of taste on Flask. And if we want to practice more, take a look at the documentation and look at how you can incorporate that for your security tools. Then in the notes, in the next part, when we work with web applications, you often see OWASP is referred to. That's Open Web Application Security Project. There are guidelines and techniques and tools and things like that that are suggested for web application. And so in this field, we want to explore, right, what they recommend and also the tools that would be useful, especially for cross-site injection, cross-site scripting. So there are various areas and the common vulnerabilities are listed here. So if you go to the top 10, and they normally update this here and there, it's not that frequent, but you can read some details there. So command injection is used for SQL, NoSQL, LDAP commands to access when they don't have the credential to your site. Now, this is when application is not validating or filtering. So not only that you sanitize data, you have to validate what is being input, and then you would run application firewall to make sure that you filter traffic coming to your site. Then you also, when you validate and sanitize, you set up a filter criteria, right, or condition for how the data should be input. That also helps with cleaning the data set down the line, because when you're pulling reports or using data for analysis, if you lack sanitization in data, you're going to run into dirty data or a lot of data that you don't need. Okay. So then in cross-site scripting, the attackers would, again, like what we said, would execute some kind of arbitrary code. And that usually from a web standpoint, that would be your JavaScript. And this is an issue, especially if we don't control it, right? You've probably seen tutorial videos on how cross-site scripting works. Cross-site scripting is often used with other form of injection or attacks. It is a way that they would be able to access data, and they're interested in pulling data when they do cross-site scripting. Now, for the cross-site scripting store, sometime application would store data somewhere, and without validation, that can be used to be viewed by other user or administrator. So when you're looking at internal enterprise, that could be administrator. When you're looking from an attacker standpoint, somebody can have access to the data that is stored. Now, reflected cross-site scripting is a way to use raw data that is being input or supplied by the user as part of HTML or JavaScript output. So that way it can be shown or it can be viewed or it can be accessed. The DOM for this is a way that we can, from a pen tester standpoint, is to execute commands on the browser itself. And it is a way to take their credential or hijack the session, because in session hijack, right, usually you basically steal the credential and be able to do something with that. Or it could be installing malware and other things. Okay. Now, the cross-site request forgery is a way to attack the user using the user credential from another website. So, and this is why you see that now a lot of the browser company would assess how you use your password on that same browser to see if you're reusing the same password. So when the user reusing the same access or the credential login, what happens is they're prone to other form of attack. So now, because when you do the post request, it forces the browser to authenticate as the victim, and it spoofed the actual request for HTTPS. So they forged to be your credential. And so that way it would give them a session cookie and authentication information. So that's a way that they can impersonate someone as well. Okay, and be able to access. And so for an application that allows this, it becomes vulnerable. So in the next part, we can answer this question. What is cross-site scripting? Right? It is a way that the attacker or a tester can execute arbitrary code on the website. So if you're testing the site, you can see if you can run the script or add the script to the form and see if you can inject it and run it. Okay. And the script could be JavaScript, right? It could also be HTML. And so when you run the code on the website, then if it's able to accept that or any untrusted data, then your users might be at risk as well. So we can sanitize the data, validate the data, and we can use templates to prevent in Flask to prevent cross-site scripting for the application. Now, in the example that you saw earlier, right, in the first couple of the pages of your notes, we saw that we can set up URL redirection securely. We can use the route function that is with the decorator. And in that, we would need to put in the conditions inside the functions on how we want to verify and sanitize the URL itself, such as the location for the redirection. Because if you don't, right, they can redirect it to their location, and that will become a problem. So the website that are infected, right, that means that, you know, their redirection has been jeopardized. There are embedded files that can be automatically downloaded and so on. Or sometimes you see waterhole, like the malicious sites that would have those things. Okay. So we can use Flask in an effective way for security, in that we would implement the templates, and then we would use components of Flask to make sure that we set up validation, sanitations to verify, right, different functionality of our sites, such as URL redirection. Any question? Okay, so that takes care of the Flask portion. Then we can answer number 6, right? We talked about forgery. And it is used for web application in a manner that they reuse the user credential of a website. It could be another website. And so when the post request is submitted, it forces the browser to authenticate as the victim and be able to send spoof HTTP requests to the attacker, including the session cookies and the authentication information that allows them to do session hijack. And so the attacker can then force the victim's browser to generate requests that will be vulnerable to the application or make the application vulnerable. So for the web assessment side, right, we would see that you would use scripts and tools. There are pre-built tools and things like that you can incorporate. But most of the time you have to be familiar with, you know, Python scripts, JavaScripts, and so on. Okay. All right, let's go to the next part. So here it gives you the common vulnerabilities. And so if you want to look at the scanning tools, you can go to the link here. OWASP provide you with different type of tools. So you can find some of the tools information here for web assessment. Okay, some of the tools are mentioned in your chapter, but not all of them because there are so many different things that we can use. Okay. And so there are pre-made tools that you can find, and then you can look for resources to read up on it. Some of them are free, most of them are free. Some of them are, you know, a trial base for a certain amount of days, and then you have some of them you have to buy their proprietary tools. Not all of them are open source. And then, you know, you can look at the platform, right? A lot of the things that we see now is going to be cloud-based because a lot of the things that we incorporate in our network and infrastructure is cloud, from the cloud or hosted in the cloud. Okay. I think we talk about Burp and some other tools here, but so that would give you a list of scan tools. Then to practice, right, and look at some of your vulnerabilities. So here you can look at the vuln web. This allows you to see, right, how you can use this with API, with Python, with PHP, and learn how to scan for SQL injection and so on. So this is a good way that you can use this URL, right, to be able to implement tests. So here, right, if you click on one of the links, it's going to take you here, and it works with like various areas, like tweets and such. Okay, so we saw that. Now, if you want to test cross-site scripting, which can be used for browser hijack, session hijack, and so on. There is a .text file that you can download with the book, or you can also find this online through FuzzDB. right? And so I copied the script for you. So here you would see that it is JavaScript. Okay. And then you can run all the attack vector from this particular file. It is a little lengthy though, because I copied the whole thing, but you can also download it from their repo, or it also provided you with the .text file. This is the name, okay, from the book. Now, if you want to use this, right, with FuzzDB, and that was the intention, you can also write the Python script in order to do that. So let's take a look at that. So this one uses sys and request module. We've seen those before. Often when you see Crosssite scripting, it would also use Beautiful Soup. Okay, so you would have the file, the .text file, within the same directory as this particular Python script. Make sure that it is accessible. So what it's going to do is going to open this file, and then it's going to go line by line. Okay, and it's going to subject each of the line and try to execute that to a target. Okay, and it's going to print out the payloads. So your URL is who your target's going to be. Okay. And then for the payload information for the field, right, it's going to submit different things. So this allows it to automate. So when we use the script, we would be able to automate it, right, with Fuzz. And so that means that we have to incorporate it with the tool and using the file. And on that file, we want to list line by line on what we wanted to achieve. Okay, so ultimately you are going to have payload information from the response and some details in the prior section for the payloads for the Crosssite. Okay, now if we don't use a file, you can directly test SQL injection. Again, we can test it to the site. So we put in our target. Now in SQL injection for this particular website, you can actually use cat. And with that, you can put in different parameter, right? Or values, characters, and things like that. So in SQL injection, we basically want to inject characters and numbers to see if it's going to give you any kind of output. Okay. Or be able to view the payload information as what is shown here in this in this script. Okay. So now let's go back to the assignment. Oh, we're going to come back to 12 and we're going to do that. Okay, so let's talk about some of the analysis with your dynamic content. As you know, that a lot of companies use WordPress, Joomla, and other tools. Okay, and those things are content management system. Okay, so if they use WordPress to create some content for their website, then they're using content management system. There are tools that sometimes you pay for or sometimes they're free. Okay, so for number 7, it asks you what is a system that contains web application analysis tools and example for those tools. Now, you know that WordPress is vulnerable. It has security issues. They recommend that if you're using WordPress, you are cautious about it, right? You have to implement security practices regardless of the tool that you use, of course. Okay. So once we answer the CMS, we can look at this section. Now, in pen testing, we would use the CMS to really obtain, right, user groups information. We also want to ultimately all our tools to assess for the web is we examine plugins. And plugins will tell you whether that application is vulnerable or not, right? If it is outdated, if there's misconfiguration, if there's certain plugins that uses services that have flaws. So for number 8, ask you to describe how CMS is useful in pen testing. We can say that it is useful to obtain user information, group information, administrative interface. It also helps you identify outdated plugins, bad configurations, and facilitating tasks such as session management, searches, shopping cart modules, and so many more elements that would be part of the dynamic content on your web page. Okay, and all of those things tie back to a certain type of plugins. So a way that we can look at the vulnerability in the plugins for CMS is to use, this should be one word, CMSMap. Okay, so this is the next section right here. This is a scanner that is used on the CMS application. And it refers to the exploit database to look at the vulnerability for the plugins. Very similar to a lot of the other scanner, right? We talked about like some scanner uses like CVE database to be able to give you details, right? So on this one, it used the exploit database. And so if you click this, it takes you to the page. And so here documents, right, different type of exploit and the platform. And so it's able to retrieve the vulnerability from what's in the database here. Now, if you want to use, right, assuming that you have the CSMap. So if you clone the repo, you should be able to have the Python file, and you can run that using Python command. Okay. As a result, you are going to get information that's going to be categorized, or output that will be categorized. Some stuff is going to be information. Some things would have low, medium, or high security ratings or vulnerability ratings. And you will find other type of scanners that will fall under the CMS scanners, okay, depending on what you want to use. Let me scroll down a little bit. Okay. So if you want to look for, right, or detect exploit in WordPress, Joomla, and some of the common CMS, you would use Vulnernex. Or WP Scan is going to allow you to check the plugins for WordPress and look for the files such as configuration, information, or backup. Now, WA Scan, if you look at the link that's provided by the book, they had disable, or that link is not active. And if you access the WA Scan, it's going to take you to Qualys. Okay. So now, sorry, let me see if I can pull it up. So if you look at Qualys, it tells you, you know, this is the web app scanning, how it works with the cloud, some highlights. If you want to look at malware, deep scanning, there's so many different things for there. But if you look at this, right, it tells you that you can scan it for the web app. Okay. And then you can look at their book for the details. So we can select at least 2, right? You have 3 there, so about 2 of the scanners. I chose WP Scan and WA Scan, mainly because using WA Scan, you can use fuzz. You can also look at forms and payloads and search similar to some of the other ones. WP Scan, it checks for plugins and also files. Okay, so you want to complement the tools that you have, or to make sure that your tool sets are diverse. But of course, you can use all 3. Any question regarding CMS scanners? Okay, so let's talk about SQL injection next. So SQL injection is a way that attacker can obtain data through using non-validating inputs for query. Most of your websites and your web application is tied to some form of database, whether it's for user accounts or products, or some of the resources maybe online, like videos, music, and so on. So SQL injection is a way that they can obtain data by taking advantage of non-validating input. So again, we come back to the input validation and how important that is in security for the web application or application in general. So now if we control it, right? So this is why sometimes when you're trying to create a password and they don't allow you to use a certain symbol, right? Because that symbol might be used in query, like for example, the equal sign. Sometimes you cannot use question marks and so on. So they control the fields, right? And also a certain number of characters. You cannot exceed a certain amount of characters because we don't want them to inject a long script in there. And so the attacker can use, right, the injection method to submit various SQL or SQL queries. Now, you know that not everybody use relational or SQL in general. They can also use NoSQL. And so there are also tools for that too. A lot of the times they're interested in the credentials, so username and password. Here is an example for that, right? It's a way that they can query a certain column, and that is going to give them information. Could be a column for the username and the password. Because on the relational database table, what you see is often when you register for the user account, the first field is going to be the username, the second field, right? The second column is going to store hash password. So, they can assess and be able to find or submit query and be able to find something there. So here, what you see in the book is they give you an example. So for example, we saw this site earlier, right? Now, if you put in the cat is 1, what you see is you see product information. Now you can also modify this, right? And use other characters, symbols, and numbers to be able to have some kind of output. So as we put in some parameter for cat and also use other characters, we can see that we can manipulate how the URL is going to show us the content, right? the data. And we can manipulate it by changing, right, the end of the URL. So instead of cat is 1, I can modify it to use percentage symbol. This is why you cannot use percentage symbol in your password as well, right? And some numerical value, an operator, and so on. Now, FuzzDB also contain information about what characters you can use for inject. So you can use like or, and then you can put in like a certain criteria for the characters. And then you can use union or select. So a lot of times it's gonna apply this in the parameter to give you the result. And keep in mind that this is not everything. This is just a suggested list that's commonly used for the characters. Okay. So in the next part, what we're going to do is you are going to test it. So you're going to visit the site, right? The Vone and web. And then you should be able to see the product information like what we see with the posters. Can you modify this cat portion like what the book shows? And then play with the values and your operators to add it in there and see if that changes. Okay, so it should be that your cat parameter becomes vulnerable to injection because we're able to modify this and use it with other characters and values to get a different output. Okay. So the answer here would be yes. And that comes from the cat parameter for that particular site. Any question? Just a few more and then we'll be done. Okay, hang tight. So in the next part, after this, so once you can try, you can play with it, you can test it so that way you can at least experience a little bit of how you can test in SQL injection. Okay. Now, what if we want to do it with Python? Okay. So just like what you've done manually, where you just gonna insert this, right? We can automate that process by having it read the file and then go through and be able to test the actual target site. Okay, so here it's going to read the file and then go through and be able to apply that to the target. Any question? Now, also keep in mind that, you know, some would work with, there are different type of SQL, right? You have MySQL and you have Microsoft SQL. So this is why it shows you here that it is different. And then you got Postgres, you got Oracle, and so on. So if you don't know what kind of database that they have or what kind of SQL that's used for the database, then you can write a script to implement the conditions. So it's going to try different things there. Okay. Any question? Okay. So we touch on that. Let's talk about you can also use Nmap script for SQL injection, right? Nmap got tons of different script for different purposes. And so I put in the link for you to visit that and look up information on how you can incorporate Nmap, which is, it scans ports and, you know, OS and so on. but we can also use it with the script for injection and brute force and things like that. Okay, so we can see that there. All right. So one of the scanner that you can use is called the SQLMap. This is used to detect vulnerability. There are three things that is happening with SQLMap, what it uses. So it's gonna implement, or it uses multiple requests. It's gonna submit multiple requests to the website. And using the vulnerable parameters for the URL through get and post. Because when you connect to a web server, right, that's usually just get and post for the response and request. Now, how can I use it to detect injection? Well, when it detects injection, it uses Boolean-based blind and also time-based, union query-based, and stack queries. And so these are related to database. So this is why it's important for you to learn how to use SQL. For to attack server or assess a server, we can use it to examine the SQL database table, because all database, if they are relational, starts with the table. So it would give you table names, whether it's downloadable. So it will be able to give you the option if it is downloadable. And then it can perform, you can automate the query process, which saves time and effort. So SQLMap is a good option for SQL injection assessment, okay? And there are other tools that are listed in the following of the note page. So you have browser exploit against SSL. There's a little bug flying around. Or TLS called Beast, because a lot of now I think the majority of our sites are using HTTPS, which uses TLS and SSL. So Beast is used to attack or exploit encryption algorithm for SSL and TLS. Browser recon and exfiltration with the compression for hypertext breach is an attack that uses different technique for HTTP to get data, even if it's encrypted. Okay. And then third thing is going to be factoring attack on RSA export keys called Freak, or short for Freak. And that is going to be for implementation for SSL and TLS protocol in general. So as you can see, right, even if we use encryption for web and through HTTPS, right, we implement SSL or TLS. And even so, right, there are open source tools that are available to attack or assess for pen testing. So you can find this on page 12 of the notes. Okay. And then there are techniques and tools that are also further discussed. So for example, Poodle for Oracle, and then renegotiation, that will be an attack for middleman with login negotiation. And the famous Heartbleed is for SSL. This is an exploit on the cryptographic libraries for a certain version. So you got to take a look at your plugins and also the resources that your application uses. If it is dated, right, and it's not updated, that can also be a problem. Okay. Now, if you go to Heartbleed you can get more details on it, and also on exploit DB, this is the ID for Heartbleed vulnerability. So how can you assess this in Python? So to write it in Python, I included the following script here. Okay. So there are some parsing mechanism that you would see at the top here. And then as you look further, right, you are going to have your container that would contain some information for injection and also to test. Okay. So the functionality of this can be useful, but then yet it is more lengthy in the case that if you want to customize your own tool for Heartbleed. Okay. And not everybody upgrade from SSL to TLS, and not everybody use the latest version of SSL. So, you know, simply for us to scan, we'll be able to also determine the version as well. And so you can also build tools to be able to scan for that. Okay. All right, so let's address this part. And you can obtain that from the notes. Any question? Let me move up a little bit so you can see both parts. So that would conclude chapter 10, which talks about web application assessment when we look for vulnerabilities. And I also touch a little bit on Flask and how that ties to web application. In the next chapter, we are going to do number 14. Oh, no, 14, I included all three, but you can just include one. I don't need, all I want you to do is describe a type of exploit used for SSL. Okay, so you don't have to include all three, but you can pick one out of the many from the notes. Oh. Is your file different? Oh, wait. Okay. So factoring attack consists of exploiting vulnerabilities, certain implementation that allows injection. I see what you mean by that. Let me double check my notes and make sure that it matches. Okay. Yeah, I didn't have everything. So let me fix this and then I'll add it back onto the notes for you. So I'll have that. Let me highlight it so I remember. Okay, sometime I did it in a hurry and I forgot to include it. Okay, so pick one for number 14. You don't have to include all of them because there are quite a few. And then for 13, we can just describe how SQLMap is the functionality of the SQLMap. So in the lab this week, we will implement some of the tools along with using the Python for our scripts. Okay, so this class is really addressing some of the techniques and the tools that you can use. So using the tools, we can write the equivalent Python script, of course, as some of these tools also uses Python. So you can either incorporate it as an API, or you can access some resources on the tool, like what we've seen in the past for our other labs. Okay. Any question? Okay, so let me stop recording.